Hello and welcome to A Conversation with Carl. Please remember to like, follow, and subscribe for the latest content. I am very excited to be speaking with today's guest, Dr. Alon Burstein, a political scientist, visiting assistant professor at Tufts University, and founder of the Israel-Palestine Report. An award-winning scholar of political violence, radicalization, and democratic processes, Alon specializes in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, combining empirical rigor with historical context to make complex Middle Eastern dynamics accessible to policymakers and the public. Welcome, Dr. Alon Burstein, to the conversation.
Thank you, Carl. Thank you for that very lovely introduction.
Well, thanks for joining me today. So I want to start with, before we get into the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, what's going on in Iran? Every day, I think we're at the brink of disaster, and then we come back and we're not. So where are we on that today?
Pretty much where we are today, too. Basically, if we go back, if we scale back, when the war started, Israel and the United States both had different goals that they set out. None of those goals have been fully achieved. Some of them have not been achieved at all. Some of them might be achieved with negotiations later on. But right now, the priorities for the United States have shifted. If their initial aims were nuclear deal, ballistic missiles, Iran supporting proxies, now what Trump is focused on is opening the Straits of Hormuz and then locking in a negotiation for the nuclear deal and maybe ballistic missile program, and that's not mentioned, etc. So right now we're only focused on the Strait of Hormuz, and there Iran and the United States are just speaking at cross purposes. Iran is talking about the future deal in which they'll be able to charge and control the Straits. The United States is talking about returning to how it was before the war. So that's where we are.
And then where do you see this going? Or you have no idea?
I mean, they teach you in political science to be very careful with predictions. So I'm certainly not going to say also because I really don't know where this is going to go. Because Trump, a lot of people think that it's a lack of strategy, that he says contradictory things all the time. I think sometimes it is, but more often than not, I think it's a strategy unto itself to make sure that we don't know. That doesn't mean that he knows, but we really don't know. If we follow what he has said just in the last 48 hours, we're about to launch massive carnage on Iran, and also, actually, it's going well, and talks are going on right now. Trump has said talks are going on literally as we're recording this. Iran has said they're not. So, who do you believe? Usually, in the United States and the West, we like to believe the more Western side, but Trump has said opposing things all the time. So, it's very difficult to know. I would say that the critical date, obviously, is the beginning of November. Once the midterms, as the closer we get, Trump's going to be under more pressure to just end it. After that, though, we may have a return.
And then I want to switch topics for listeners less familiar with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Could you give a quick primer on its origins and what led to the current situation, which I know is not quick, but...
I mean, it's hard to give a quick primer. I teach courses on this. It's a 15-week course, twice a week, an hour and a half each session, and still we don't cover everything. So it's extremely hard to give a quick primer. But essentially, if we go back, some people would start this 2,000 years ago. Some people would start this 1,500 years ago. The modern Israeli-Palestinian conflict really goes back to the end of the 19th century when the Zionist movement, a movement of Jews in Europe, started to request a national homeland for the Jewish people facing antisemitism and persecution. And they set their sights on what was then called Palestine under the Ottoman Empire because it was a Jewish kingdom there 2,000 years ago, and religiously it's important to the Jews. And there was a small Jewish presence there then. This then led to the British also granting the Zionist movement rights in Palestine, and this came very much angered the local population, which then there was all kinds of nationalist movements in Jordan and Syria, and the local population in Palestine were saying, wait a minute, what about us? This obviously has a lot of spirals and iterations, but that is where things eventually emerge. In 1948, or 1947, the United Nations votes to partition the area of Palestine to make a Jewish state and an Arab state. The Zionist movement accepted this. Contrary to what most people have been taught, the Palestinians didn't exactly reject it. There was no Palestinian leadership at that time, but the Arab League rejected it. Israel was declared in 1948. No Arab state was declared. And from that point, Palestinians became refugees. And then there was organizations that were going to liberate Palestine to destroy Israel. And that's where the conflict then it takes off in lots of different directions.
So then today, where are we at this crossroads? Where do you see us as today?
So in the 1990s, there was the biggest attempt to come to a resolution between the sides. That was called the Oslo process and the Oslo Accords. And that created a semi-autonomous government called the Palestinian Authority in an area that Israel had taken over in 1967, the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip. Right now, there is Israel that exists, and there's a Palestinian Authority that is not a country, but has some autonomy in some areas where Palestinians are under Israeli occupation. And then there's the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip was taken over by Hamas, a more fundamentalist organization, in 2007, and they launched the October 7th attack, which I presume everyone has heard of in the last 3 years, and that led to Israel invading Gaza. So right now we're at a major crossroads. This crossroads may last for 5 years. I'm not saying it's going to be resolved tomorrow, but what is for sure is we're not going to go back to where we were 4 years ago. So we have 3 different players: Israel, the Palestinian Authority, and Hamas. Everyone's trying to make different deals, and where we end up in the next phase is going to be what determines the future of the conflict.
My next question also, does Hamas have a future say? And also, are there moderate Palestinian leaders that Israel can look to help lead the Palestinian people to a two-state solution? Or is that not even in the picture?
So I'll answer that in 3 phases. You asked 2 questions, but
yes,
I'll be a good Jew and I'll answer it in 3 ways.
Yes.
First, I'll say that when it comes to does Hamas have a say, technically, as part of Trump's 20-point plan that was supposed to end the Gaza war, Hamas is not supposed to have a say. The fact is that Hamas de facto controls about 35% of the Gaza Strip, which controls the vast majority of the population in Gaza, Palestinians, about 1.9 million Palestinians. Hamas has about 25,000 armed troops, and they do control the government there. Now, they have said they might relinquish, they might not, but that's up to them at this point. And I will say in a side note that when a lot of people say Israel should just go in and finish the job, that's not really realistic. Israel was trying to finish that job in an active war for 2 years of very harsh war in Gaza. It's not that easy to destroy a group like Hamas. And the fact is, Israel failed to do that in 2 years. But at this point, Hamas is not supposed to have a say. De facto, it has a lot of say on the future. So that's 1. 2, in terms of, is there a hope for a two-state solution? So we have to look also at the Palestinian side and also at the Israeli side. In Israel, the current government's outgoing government, there's elections coming up in 3 months, but the current government has a lot of elements in it that have sworn that there will never be a Palestinian state. Now, there is a counter voice in Israel of more dovish figures that do want a Palestinian state. But at this point, the Palestinian side has not been under a lot of pressure to answer to do they want a state or not, because the Israeli government also has not been facilitating that. So that's one of the challenges, because some people say that there are moderate Palestinians, and then people ask, so why haven't they spoken up? And their answer is because Israel hasn't wanted the two-state solution either. So it's very complicated to point out who are the moderates. There are moderate Palestinian leaders. There definitely are. There's Salam Fayyad, there's Mohammed Dahlan. These are people who are not Zionists. They're not lovers of Israel. But they have said over the years, fighting Israel doesn't help, and we need to come up with another solution. So that doesn't mean that they would necessarily agree to a two-state solution the way Israel wants. That doesn't mean that if they were put in power, there would be peace and prosperity in the Middle East. But they have advocated that things like October 7th don't help the Palestinians. They just bring about disaster. So that's more the moderate side that we're looking at in the Palestinian side at this point.
And then when we're looking at the election, Gadi Eisenkot is the front runner. What does that look like against Bibi? And does Bibi Netanyahu have a shot at winning this again? Or
I often say about Netanyahu, love him or hate him, he is one of the most brilliant politicians. He has come back time and again in Israel when it seemed like he was done for. He has come back to lead to victory, very often through making alliances with different parties and then backstabbing them. But nonetheless, he has been the one to come out on top each and every time. What's the problem that Netanyahu is facing, in addition to his corruption charges that he's under and he's in trial, the problem that he's facing is that he has accumulated a lot of political enemies, primarily through this backstabbing, whether it was Avigdor Lieberman or Naftali Bennett, or Yair Lapid or Benny Gantz. He's accumulated a lot of enemies. And so he might win and become the biggest party. That doesn't mean that he'll have enough allies to form a coalition. Because in Israel, because the parliamentary system is not like a presidential system. The president wins, he can be a Republican and the entire Congress be Democrat. Not in Israel. You need a coalition, you need a majority in parliament. So Netanyahu, leading the Likud, might still be the biggest party. He's not likely, according to the current polls, 3 months is a long time in the Middle East. According to the current polls, he's not likely to be able to form a coalition, but that doesn't mean that he will be ousted because Eisenkot also might not be able to form a coalition. We might be looking at a situation like we had in 2019 where no side manages to win. So we go to another election round 3 to 5 months later. And during this time, Netanyahu stays prime minister. At this point, looking at the polls, that's Netanyahu's best hope. But again, it could change at any point.
And then where does foreign politics play in Bibi's re-election? Because I would say that Mandami this week, in the last few weeks, when the mayor of New York City made a press conference, said he was going to arrest him, didn't arrest him, can't arrest him when he comes here. I think that plays into, and I might be wrong, I don't know Israeli politics as well as you do, but to me, that looks like it plays into a great campaign ad for Bibi.
It does, because very often the fact that Netanyahu is seen, right, Mamdani is viewed, right or wrong, factually, is viewed by many in Israel as anti-Zionist, anti-Jewish, anti-Israel, and therefore, right, having him single out Netanyahu as a bad person, okay, well, the one who hates Israel and the Jews hates Netanyahu, that's positive for Netanyahu at that moment. Where Netanyahu is vastly weakened internationally at this point is the fact that the other Middle Eastern countries, primarily Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, they have all bypassed Netanyahu in having Trump's ear. Netanyahu is the one that comes to the White House the most, but the fact is that when it comes to deciding the future of the war with Iran, when it comes to even deciding what's going to happen in the Gaza Strip, which is the biggest threat for Israel, or deciding what's going to happen in Lebanon, Trump is very, very blatantly not consulting Israel. He's very blatantly listening to these other countries and then putting out messages on Truth Social saying, and Israel's obligated to whatever I just said, when the Israeli government, according to the ministers in government, have not even been told about it. That's what's hurting Netanyahu, because he positioned himself all these years as being the one who can compel the United States, who can work with the United States, who can convince the president. And right now, he's seemed very weak in that arena.
And do you think Prime Minister Netanyahu generally seeks peace, or is he just because this is the question that I hear from a lot of people in America. He is just prolonging the conflict so he doesn't have to go to prison.
Look, it's obviously an extremely controversial question, but I'll answer it. And I'll say, firstly, I don't think that Netanyahu, if he had the choice of remaining prime minister, staying out of jail, and having peace in the Middle East, I don't think he'd be against peace. And there are, by the way, others who would not choose that. The supreme leader of Iran has as a mission to export the revolution. Peaceful coexistence in the Middle East with him staying in control is not what he would choose. Netanyahu, I think, right, in a very, very ideal world would choose that. But the fact is we don't live in an ideal world. And while Netanyahu, during the 90s, did continue with the Oslo Accords and sign some of the deals he was obligated to sign, and in 2009 did make a declaration that Israel would aspire towards a two-state solution under pressure from then U.S. President Obama, over the last decade, Netanyahu has adopted far more hawkish stances, among others because the Israeli population has also moved towards the right, because the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been stuck, and because, like I said, his pool of allies has shrunk. And so he's become much more reliant on the more hawkish extreme figures like Bezalel Smotrich, Itamar Ben-Gvir, so he's had to, politically, move towards that side. Does this mean that he's prolonged the war solely to stay out of jail? That's a very political question. I will say that many analysts have pointed to situations where Netanyahu could have influenced an end to the war and facilitated where Israel would be the one that decided when the war ended, and said that he chose more to try for a military victory, which led us to Trump eventually saying, okay, the war is done, and not really listening to Israel.
And then Israel may hold the military advantage on the ground, but many argue it's lost the global PR battle. Was turning international public opinion against Israel's legitimacy a deliberate objective of Hamas's October 7th attack, or an unintended byproduct that just happened?
So the October 7th attack, contrary to how it's often portrayed as it was sponsored by Iran or it was all about derailing, there was negotiations with Israel and the Saudis, the October 7th attack actually was supposed to happen. Hamas had planned it 6 months before that. It was supposed to happen the eve of Passover of 2023. It was, according to the documents of Hamas, long before the negotiations with Saudi Arabia. Nonetheless, Hamas does have a global vision. And it certainly did want, it did want to interrupt Israel's positioning itself in the Middle East. And if along the way it could possibly also damage Israel's international reputation, it would certainly do that. Hamas did not expect Israel to retaliate the way it did. And again, its documents show this. They thought the October 7th attack was supposed to go very differently, and they thought that this would be a month-long campaign. Only after Israel carried out this massive bombing campaign at the beginning of October and international protests started to mount up, did Hamas change its position. And then absolutely, it became an official goal of Hamas as part of the war to make Israel look bad, to make sure that all the images of suffering in Gaza, people starving, is what's shown on the front pages. That was something that Hamas did. And I'll add one more thing. When they did the October 7th attack, they recorded all the horrendous acts that happened. By the end of October 2023, Hamas spearheaded a campaign to take those recordings down because they said international sentiment of who's doing the horrendous acts is turning against Israel. Make sure that our recordings are no longer seen. So they definitely have a thought process of international public opinion.
Didn't the hostages play a big role in keeping the war going? It might have been only a month-long campaign had there been no hostages.
So again, it's difficult to hypothesize because most of the documents that were seized by Hamas suggest that October 7th went a lot better for Hamas than they thought it would. They expected the Israeli military to not collapse and to be able to hold their ground. And while they prepared for a massive campaign and to take hostages, they are the ones who asked for the first hostage deal because they took way more hostages than they expected. Their orders to their units were kidnap as many people as you can, but they didn't expect all their units to get through. So they had planned for a very different style of campaign. That doesn't mean that taking, 50 hostages is not a crime against humanity as opposed to 200. I'm saying they had planned for a very different type of campaign. And according to hostages that were released, and some of them were held by Hamas leaders like Yahya Sinwar, Izzadin Haddad, and they spoke to them. The hostages said, the leaders told us, don't worry, you'll be home within a month, because they didn't believe that Israel would not just acquiesce to the terms of releasing prisoners in exchange for the hostages. So technically, yes, it was the hostages situation that perpetuated it, but Israel could have also acquiesced to Hamas's demands, and the group thought that they would, and Israel did not. And that's where it goes back to your previous question. Did Netanyahu do this for military reasons or political reasons? That's where people accuse him of different things.
And then ordinary Israelis face widespread hostility and collective blame due to mandatory conscription, where citizens of other aggressive states like Russia rarely face that same personal scrutiny abroad. What accounts for this double standard?
So I'll say two things about that. Firstly, I have noticed, and it's one of the things that surprised me, that a lot of people think that Israel is actually treated more favorably compared to other countries. And the reason for this is because countries like Russia or countries like Syria or countries like, Afghanistan or Iran face a lot of international sanctions when they carry out activity that is heavily condemned by the world. Whereas Israel tends to be in international bodies, it's heavily condemned, but it does not face the same level of sanctions. Russian citizens can't use their passport to travel to most countries, whereas Israelis can. So I've been surprised, because I agree very much with your question, but I've been surprised to hear some people say, no, Israel's treated actually better compared to other countries, and that's where some people look at that. But why are Israelis specifically singled out as differently? One, you cannot overlook centuries of anti-Semitism. There is a fact that Jews internationally, even though most countries have strict laws and actually do try to curtail anti-Semitism, just like we talk about systemic racism in the United States, you can't overlook thousands of years of anti-Semitism and pretend it all goes away in a couple of decades. So there is that. There is the fact that Jews tend to be singled out as even, you asked about Israelis, but even Jewish citizens in France. Yeah, but who are you loyal to? So that's one facet of it. And another facet of it is the fact that I would argue the Palestinian cause has vastly more echo than any other cause in the world. And again, some people say this is because of anti-Semitism. Some people say it's because of how long the occupation and conflict has gone on. And there's validity in both arguments. What I often tell my students and tell people, regardless of the reason, it's fact. More people know where Gaza is and where the conflict is. They haven't heard about the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan. They haven't heard about what's happening in the Kurdish areas of Iraq. They haven't. So, right or wrong.
I will argue with you on that point is that when I watch TikTok videos or Insta videos and they ask kids and kids, I mean like the 18 to 25-year-olds, where's the river and where's the sea? They don't know what river is and they don't know what sea we're
they have no
talking
clue.
about. They have no idea about that. They have no idea about what this river and sea they're talking about, but they do know Palestinian.
Let me correct if it sounded
Okay.
like I said people are well versed and know a lot about the conflict. No. That was not my intention at all.
Okay.
What I mean is that everyone in the world, right, when we hear about conflicts, you ask most people in the United States, who's right and wrong, Russia or Ukraine? Ask most people in the Western world. Yeah, Russia's the aggressor. But in reality, they have no idea who it is or what it is. What I'm saying is, to a much larger degree in the world, the Palestinian cause has created a situation where everyone knows, quote unquote, yeah, Israel's bad and Palestinians are the victims when they don't actually know anything about it. But what I'm saying is much harsher conflicts, much worse disasters, Yemen, the Houthis, Saudis, they haven't heard about at all. So this just goes back to your question, why are Israelis targeted more? Because people know nothing about the conflict, but the Palestinian cause, knowing, quote unquote, that Israel is the villain, is something that has permeated into everywhere in the world. And the reasons for that, again, we can debate, but it's just a fact. And that's why.
See, I see you can't get rid of Israel and you can't get rid of the Palestinian people. So you definitely need a two-state solution. I just don't know how you get there.
So, many people say that, and there's a lot of truth in that. Others have pointed out to the fact that, historically, we have had a lot of circumstances where populations have relocated, where you've had confederacies or different types of governments come up and represent different sides. I myself am, I will say, a minority within the, I would say, wider academic community that studies the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, because I don't think the two-state solution is dead. Most people look at it and they look at the map, they look at Gaza, they look at this, and they're like, what are you talking about? There's no hope for this anymore. And when I always come back to people and say, yes, but Israel occupied the West Bank and the Gaza Strip in 1967. In 1987, the first Intifada breaks out, that is a Palestinian uprising, and Israel was suppressing it brutally. No one would have believed that within 5 years, there would be the Oslo process. Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin would be shaking hands with Arafat. Similarly, in 2002, it's the height of the second Intifada, suicide bombs going off all over Israel. Israel's launching massive campaigns in the West Bank, and within 3 years, Israel pulled out its settlements from the Gaza Strip. In the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we have big changes, usually as a result of massive uproar. We're now in the middle of a massive uproar. I would not be surprised if by 2030, there's a different reality. It may not be two states, but I don't think we can actually predict, because each and every time from catastrophe, something new emerges.
And then where's the line between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism? This is the thing that we always talk about, right? We hear this all the time. Are you anti-Zionistic?
It's unfortunately become a politicized question, because many people say there is no distinction. And therefore, if you criticize Israel, you're really using that as a mask to criticize Judaism and Jews because of anti-Semitism. Others say, no, it's not true. And part of the reason why I laughed is because it also comes to the question of what does it mean to be a Zionist? I get asked all the time, are you a Zionist? I'm like, I don't know what that means. I'm an Israeli citizen. Does that make me a Zionist? I think that Jews deserve a national homeland just like any other nation. Does that make me a Zionist? I'm not necessarily pro some of the things the Israeli military does, so am I not a Zionist anymore? It's very it's a buzzword. It's become a buzzword that people use. Are you a Zionist or an anti-Zionist? Generally speaking, from an academic standpoint, which is not what most people want to hear, but from an academic standpoint, I would say anti-Semitism is prejudice on all forms, from hatred to just suspicion to whatever, against Jews on basis of their Judaism, and on basis, it's become also racialized in the 20th century on the basis of race and ethnicity. Whereas anti-Zionism would be considered either critique or prejudice against the state of Israel due to the national stance of the state of Israel. Now, Israel defines itself as a Jewish homeland. It's the only Jewish state. That's why they get conflated. But that's where often the distinction would be academically. The fact that some people are anti-Zionist because they're anti-Semites or vice versa is a whole other matter. But the distinction would be if you're biased against Jews or critical of Israel. Israel would be anti-Zionist. Anti-Semitism would be biased against Jews themselves.
So for people trying to navigate this overwhelming conflict, and they're often polarized information depending on what bubble you're in and where you're reading your stuff, what framework or advice do you offer to help distinguish fact from fiction?
It's, I started the Israel-Palestine Report, which is my YouTube channel, mostly because I was stunned at the level of misinformation. I was not on social media, and my students came up to me. I started it on October 8th of 2023 because my students came up to me and were asking questions. I was like, what are you talking about? Where did you get that misfact that you're quoting? And they would show me. I was like, okay, you need to be able to have access to different information. So it's not surprising, and people shouldn't feel like they are missing something if they can't find accurate information, because it's very, very difficult. I would say two things. Firstly, people need to try to distinguish the facts from the interpretations that are given to the facts. So if, for example, right, there was shortly after the war broke out, a bomb went off, an explosion happened in Al Ahli hospital in Gaza. And immediately within an hour, everyone was saying Israel bombed the hospital. Then Israel was saying, no, it was a Palestinian rocket. And everyone came up to me and said, what's the truth? And I said, it's been an hour. We don't know. The truth that we know is that there was an explosion in the hospital, many people died, and that can be tragic regardless of who's at fault. Distinguish the facts from the fault. The fault is something that very often we don't know, and very, very rarely in bloody conflicts is there one side that's pure and one side that's a villain, right? Russia and Ukraine. Ukraine's committed lots of crimes also. Lots of war crimes. This is just the nature of war. So you can be in favor of one side, in favor of another side, but try to distinguish when you're hearing news from the facts and from the interpretation that usually the people giving the news are giving those facts. You can listen to something, and you can listen to a pro-Israeli site, you can listen to Al Jazeera. Both can give you facts. And, if something doesn't sound right, cross-check it with something else. But you can try to distinguish still the facts from the interpretation that then is leveled onto it. That's the first thing that I would say. And the second thing that I would say is assume that you don't know everything. People today are bombarded with way too much information. And it used to be perfectly acceptable to say, yeah, no, I'm a carpenter, I'm a bus driver, I don't know what the tariff rate should be, and I don't know if, the United States should impose this level of sanction, that level of sanction, because I'm not a politician. And that's okay. Today, we all have so much information that's bombarded us, and we have to say we know everything. Actually, it's okay to say the truth is, I don't know. And that's okay. And be comfortable with that. That's why I always tell people, be comfortable with not knowing everything.
And then, as someone who's done research on political violence and collective action, what does academic evidence suggest is actually required to break the cycle of radicalization and achieve long-term stability? And that's an easy question, though.
So one of the things that I have said, and this goes back to what I said that, saying Israel should go in and finish the job is not realistic. Historically, there are maybe 4,000 terror groups in the last 60 years that have carried out international terrorism, cross-border terrorism, not about domestic, like cross-border terrorism, separatist terrorism, things like that. Exactly one has been annihilated solely by force. It's extremely hard to kill an idea and extremely hard to kill something. So you don't manage to annihilate these things solely by force. In turn, you also don't tend to manage to break the cycle just by capitulation. That's not saying so stop the military action. But if we look at cases like the IRA, if we look at cases like Colombia and the FARC, if we look at so many cases where violence has de-escalated and it was more radical than the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but has de-escalated, this has always happened as a result of, on the one hand, repression, military or police pressure, but also by opening up an avenue for the other side to have a different outcome. Because bottom line, most people don't want to get killed themselves. Even if they're happy to see the other side killed, they don't want to risk their own lives. So if you open up a political avenue for people to achieve their goals elsewhere, they may not achieve them. Northern Ireland is still not part of the Republic of Ireland. The Basques still don't have their country, but all these terror groups diminished because the population itself started to say there are other ways that we can achieve this. And that is comparatively the only way that violence ever spirals down in any long-term solution.
And then, how has social media played a role in fanning the flames of this whole conflict?
So I think we would have to distinguish between locally in Israel and Palestinian territories and internationally. Because internationally, obviously, social media has played a huge role in public opinion and a huge role in politicians. It took it some time, right? There was a lot of public opinion and protests, but it didn't have a lot of effect on policy until the end of 2024. There, we started to see election rounds starting to happen again in places in Europe, New York, United States. All of a sudden, politicians said, oh, there's a wave to ride on here because a lot of public sentiment has to do with Israel. And you have people running for mayor positions in Southern California that are talking about their views on Israel-Palestine. What does this have to do with governing a city in California? Because that's social media. Social media said this is now something that you need to have an opinion on, even though it has nothing to do with your policy. So internationally, it's played a huge role in public opinion, primarily against Israel. Not necessarily pro-Palestine, but against Israel. Locally,
can I just say, I will say, during the election, the primary in New York, I'm a New York resident, and during the election, I would get calls all the time from all the different candidates, and I would ask them what their opinion is on Israel. They all had a statement on Israel. And then I would ask them, what's their statement on the Uyghurs? And not one of them had a statement on the Uyghurs.
Yeah.
And I thought that was bizarre at the best.
And this is what I was saying before. And lots of people say, so you see the world as a fixation on the Jews, or you see, so I say, regardless of the reason, that's a fact. Everyone needs to have an opinion on this conflict, and they know very little about this conflict. Yeah. And that's one of the things but social media has played a massive role in that. So that's internationally. Yeah. Locally, social media in Israel and the Palestinian territories also played a huge role primarily in fanning flames, because within the Palestinian sectors, social media accounts that are constantly showing the bombing and starvation that happened in Gaza in 2024 and later on 2025 had a lot of impact on Palestinians in the West Bank as well, and had a lot of impact on their anger and their potential for also wanting to see more violence against Israelis. In turn, there's been a massive upswing of Israeli settler terrorism against Palestinians in the West Bank, and that also has a lot to do with social media. I am on some of the social media accounts because I study violence in this conflict on both sides, and I get exposed to a lot of the videos that are fanning the flames from there, saying this isn't what we're doing. So it serves to fan the flames locally in terms of cycles of violence. Internationally, it's much more public opinion.
And I really don't understand why Bibi doesn't stop it. Because I feel like he could, but maybe, I kind of feel like he's fanning the flames on the West Bank.
Yeah, but that also has to do with, like I said, his turn to right-wing policies, but mostly it's his coalition partners. Again, right now in Netanyahu's government, the only parties in parliament that were willing to go with him were the ultra-Orthodox parties and Jewish power and religious Zionism. Jewish power and religious Zionism, one of the leaders, Itamar Ben-Gvir, himself has 53 indictments in the past, including 8 convictions that include incitement to Jewish terrorism and supporting terrorism. So he's the Minister of National Security. He's in charge of the police. Those are Netanyahu's allies. The old Orthodox parties, that's why Netanyahu has also passed a lot of laws in their favor. But it's not necessarily that Netanyahu is in support of this. It's that he would rather stay in power, even if it means accepting this. If other parties are willing to go with him, he probably would prefer that. But they're not.
And then as we wrap up, is there anything I should have asked you that I didn't ask you? They're like, yes, I have 300 questions.
The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is endless. Unfortunately, there's so much that we can go back to. The only thing that I would encourage people, and I'm not saying you should have asked this, I'm not being critical at all, but what I encourage people also to look at when they try to understand the conflict is look at domestic politics in each and every country, because that's something that we miss. People often say, why is Trump now not paying attention to Israel, paying attention to this? Because Trump's worried about the midterms. He couldn't care less about Qatar versus Israel. He cares about the midterms. In Iran, when they agree to go to deals or don't agree to go to deals, that's because the president has more power versus the supreme leader at that point. And in Israel also, and that's just something I encourage people also, they usually look at the premise of conflict as, well, Israel wants this and they want that. Most leaders don't care about anything except their internal politics and what will help them stay in power. And that's something that people need to remember also. They'll get deals with Israel and Lebanon. Why is Lebanon doing this now? Syria doing this now? Look internally. So that's just one thing that I encourage people. Not that you should have asked that, but when we try to understand the conflict, I encourage people to do that.
Yes. Alon Bernstein, thank you so much for joining me today. The YouTube channel is the Israel-Palestine Report. It is a must-see to understand this conflict. And thank you out there for listening. As always, let me know what you think. Put your thoughts in the comment section. And until next time, everyone, be safe.